Hello guys, what's up? This is Murtaza. Welcome back to a coder's journey. This is the second video of my series on using promises in JavaScript applications. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit about, asynchronous programming before we dive deep into the concepts of promises in JavaScript. So asynchronous programming, this is a very, important concept to understand. There are different techniques of writing asynchronous code in different platforms and different, programming languages. We want to talk about asynchronous programming in JavaScript, of course, and we will see what asynchronous programming is and how it is different, from synchronous programming, from the normal way that programmers think about, code. So basically, synchronous code is code that is executed one line at a time. So your first line of code will get executed basically, then the next line, and so on, right? So this is the basic way that all people think about code, right? But asynchronous programming is a little bit different, and of course, it is important to understand asynchronous programming and to be able to write asynchronous code in very specific situations. Of course, whenever you want to, for example, improve the user experience of your applications, the UX of your applications, it is imperative to write asynchronous code. Now, JavaScript is inherently single-threaded, right? So there is one single thread that is running your code. It means that the operations, the code that you have written is executed, one operation at a time, right? So, however, in modern web development, we often face tasks that take time to complete. For example, when you want to send a request to a backend API and receive a response, you will, have to wait for a couple of seconds, sometimes for a couple of milliseconds, in order to receive a response after you send out your request. So, it doesn't work like other normal scenarios. When you send out a request to a backend API, like for example with Axios, or when you are reading files, right? Or even when you are handling user input, all of these, scenarios require asynchronous programming, because in those cases, your code is not going to get executed one operation at a time. When you perform these operations synchronously, it can make your application unresponsive or even sluggish and slow. And of course, the user experience of your application will suffer, and chances are that users get angry or mad at you because of the code that you have written. So in these scenarios, writing asynchronous code is very important. In my opinion, the most tangible, scenario when you want to write asynchronous code is when you want to communicate with a backend API, because it takes time, right, to get the response for a request that you send to a backend endpoint, a backend API. And during this time, of course, you do not want your application to get freeze. You want to maintain the application responsiveness. You want to, make it look fast. And this is a very, good candidate of writing asynchronous code. Asynchronous programming allows us to initiate operations, right, and continue with other tasks without waiting for the first one to complete. This is, of course, in contrast to the traditional way of writing code, which is synchronous. You write your code and the code gets executed one line at a time or one operation at a time. But asynchronous programming works differently. The operations are not necessarily executed, one after the other. You can initiate, you can start an operation, right? For example, reading from a file or sending a request to a backend API to fetch some data, and then while your application is waiting for that response, is waiting for that content of the file, you can perform other tasks, right? So you are making your application responsive, and this is asynchronous code. This is asynchronous programming, right? This asynchronous programming is very important when you want to write responsive and efficient web applications. As I told you, there are different techniques when you want to write asynchronous code in JavaScript, right? For example, we've got callback methods, which we will probably talk about, and other methods like async and await. But in this playlist, we want to specifically talk about promises, right? And we want to talk about the different ways that promises help us to write asynchronous code. And one good thing that I want you to know is that Axios, as I told you about in the last episode, uses promises behind the scenes. Axios is a library for sending network requests, for communicating with a backend API to fetch some data from an endpoint, right? So Axios uses promises behind the scenes. In the playlist that I have on my YouTube channel about Axios, I have talked about it. Please go and watch that playlist as well. But before doing that, make sure you complete this series, because in order to better understand how Axios works, I think it is important to know a thing or two about promises, because promises are used behind the scenes when you want to send network requests, using Axios. So to recap, we talked about the fact that JavaScript is inherently single-threaded. It means that the operations are executed one at a time, right? But when it comes to writing when it comes to writing web applications, sometimes we want to complete tasks that take time. For example, when you want to fetch some data from an endpoint, right? When you want to read the content of a file, when you want to, for example, handle user input. In these scenarios, we want to, implement asynchronous code or write asynchronous code. And one of the best ways in JavaScript to write asynchronous code is using promises. This is it for this video. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about, promises, and little by little, I will take you to Visual Studio Code to show you guys how you can start working and coding with promises. If you enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to A Coder's Journey if you aren't subscribed yet, and stay tuned for my upcoming video in this series.